What happens when two Hollywood heavyweights with completely different worldviews sit down for what's supposed to be a lighthearted chat, and it turns into one of the most intense confrontations ever caught on camera? The tension in the studio was so thick you could cut it with a knife, and what started as friendly banter quickly spiraled into something nobody saw coming. Before we get into this explosive interview, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us what you think about what went down here. So Tim Allen walks onto the set with that signature confidence he's known for, the kind of presence that filled living rooms across America for years. Jimmy Kimmel starts things off the way he always does, with a smile and what seems like an easy question. "Tim, great to have you here. You've been in this business for decades now, and you've seen Hollywood change quite a bit. What's your take on where we are right now as an industry?" Tim settles into his chair, and you can see he's actually considering the question seriously. "Well, Jimmy, I think we're in an interesting spot. The industry has definitely evolved, and not all of it has been for the better if I'm being honest." There's a slight pause, and you can sense Kimmel's demeanor shift just a fraction. "What do you mean by that? Are you talking about the content we're making, or something else?" "I'm talking about the fact that we've become afraid," Tim says, leaning forward slightly. "Afraid to tell certain jokes, afraid to have certain conversations, afraid to let characters be flawed and real. Everything has to pass through this filter now. And I think that's stifling creativity." Kimmel laughs, but it's not his genuine laugh. It's that nervous one he does when he's about to disagree with someone. "I don't know if I'd call it fear, Tim. I think it's more about being aware, being considerate of how our words affect people." "Considerate or controlled?" Tim shoots back, and the audience goes quiet. Because from where I'm sitting it looks a lot more like the latter. You can see Kimmel trying to steer this back to safer territory. But don't you think we have a responsibility, especially those of us with platforms, to think about the impact of what we say? To evolve with the times? Tim nods slowly. "Of course we have a responsibility. But responsibility means being honest, not just telling people what they want to hear. You know what's interesting, Jimmy? You and we both started in comedy. We both know that comedy works best when it pushes boundaries, when it makes people a little uncomfortable. That's where the truth lives. Sure, but there's pushing boundaries, and then there's just being hurtful," Kimmel counters. "Don't you think there's a line?" "Absolutely there's a line," Tim agrees. "But who gets to draw that line? That's the question nobody wants to answer. Because right now, it feels like that line keeps moving, and it only moves in one direction. Say the wrong thing, use the wrong word, have the wrong opinion, and suddenly you're done. Cancelled. Erased." Kimmel shifts in his seat, clearly not expecting this level of directness. "I think you're being a bit dramatic, Tim. People face consequences for their actions. That's not new. That's always been the case." "Consequences for actions, sure," Tim says, his voice getting more animated. "But we're not just talking about actions anymore, are we? We're talking about thoughts, opinions, jokes from 20 years ago. We're talking about people losing their entire careers because they don't think exactly like everyone else wants them to think." The energy in the studio has completely changed now. This isn't the fun celebrity interview anyone tuned in for. Kimmel tries to inject some levity. "Well, I haven't been cancelled yet, so maybe it's not as bad as you think." Tim gives him a long look. "Haven't you though, Jimmy? Or have you just learned to stay inside the lines so well that you've forgotten what it's like to color outside them?" That one lands hard, and you can see it on Kimmel's face. The audience is dead silent now, everyone sensing that something significant is happening. Kimmel takes a breath, and when he speaks again, there's an edge to his voice. "So what are you suggesting, Tim? That we should all just say whatever we want, consequences be damned? That we shouldn't care about who we hurt or offend?" "That's not what I'm saying at all," Tim replies firmly. "I'm saying we should be able to have conversations like adults. I'm saying that disagreement shouldn't equal destruction. I'm saying that maybe, just maybe, we've swung too far in one direction, and we're afraid to admit it because admitting it would put a target on our backs." Kimmel leans back, crossing his arms. "And what direction is that exactly, Tim?" "The direction where everyone has to think the same way, talk the same way, believe the same things." The direction where there's no room for nuance, no room for complexity, no room for people to be human and flawed and figure things out as they go. That sounds like a pretty convenient position for someone who wants to say whatever they want without pushback, Kimmel says, and there's definitely an accusatory tone now. Tim's eyes narrow slightly. Is that what you think this is about? Me wanting to say offensive things? Because that's the problem right there, Jimmy. The moment someone questions the narrative, you assume the worst about them. You put them in a box, slap a label on them, and dismiss everything they say. Kimmel uncrosses his arms and leans forward, clearly not backing down. I'm not putting you in a box, Tim. I'm asking you to be specific. What exactly are you not allowed to say? What jokes are you dying to tell that you can't? Tim laughs, but it's not a happy sound. See, that's the trap right there. You want me to give you an example so you can pounce on it. So you can say, see, that's exactly why we need these rules. You're proving my point by asking the question that way. Or maybe I'm just trying to understand what you're actually talking about, Kimmel fires back. Because right now it sounds like you're complaining about a problem you can't even define. I can define it perfectly, Tim says, his voice steady. It's the problem of self-censorship. It's the problem of writers' rooms where people are afraid to pitch ideas. It's the problem of comedians who run every joke past a committee before they tell it. It's the problem of actors who won't take certain roles because they're terrified of the social media mob. That specific enough for you? Kimmel shakes his head. You keep calling it fear, but what if it's just growth? What if it's just people realizing that words have power and choosing to use that power more responsibly? Responsibility, Tim repeats the word slowly. That's an interesting choice, because it seems to me that being responsible means different things depending on who you are and what you believe. If you believe the right things, you can say almost anything. But if you step outside that approved worldview, suddenly you're irresponsible, you're dangerous, you need to be stopped. That's not fair, Tim, Kimmel protests. People are held accountable across the board. Are they, though? Tim challenges. Are they really? Or is there a very clear double standard that everyone sees, but nobody wants to acknowledge? You can say the most vicious things about certain people, certain groups, certain beliefs, and that's considered acceptable, even celebrated. But say something that goes against the approved narrative, and you're done. The audience is completely engaged now, some nodding, others looking uncomfortable. Kimmel's jaw tightens. You keep talking about this narrative, this approved worldview. What are you really talking about here, Tim? Because it's starting to sound like you have a very specific axe to grind. I don't have an axe to grind, Jimmy. I have a concern. A concern that we've created an environment where honest conversation is impossible because everyone's too busy performing, too busy signaling their virtue, too busy making sure they're on the right side of whatever the issue of the day is. Kimmel's voice rises slightly. So anyone who cares about social issues is just performing? Is that what you're saying? I'm saying there's a difference between genuinely caring about something and using it as a shield or a weapon, Tim responds. I'm saying there's a difference between wanting to make the world better and wanting to make sure everyone knows how much better you are than the people who disagree with you. And you think, you know which is which. You think you can judge people's motivations? Kimmel asks, his tone sharp. I think actions speak louder than words, Tim says. I think when you see people who claim to care about tolerance being absolutely intolerant of anyone who thinks differently, when you see people who preach acceptance refusing to accept any viewpoint but their own, when you see people who talk about empathy showing zero empathy for anyone outside their bubble, yeah, I start to question the motivation. Kimmel stands up slightly, then sits back down, clearly trying to control his reaction. You know what, Tim? I think you're confusing accountability with intolerance. I think you're confusing consequences with persecution. And frankly, I think you're using a lot of words to dance around what you really want to say. What do I really want to say, Jimmy? Please tell me, since you seem to know my mind better than I do. I think you're uncomfortable with change, Kimmel states flatly. I think you're uncomfortable with the fact that the world doesn't look the way it did when you started in this business. And instead of adapting, you're digging in your heels and calling it principle. Tim's expression hardens. You think this is about me being uncomfortable with change? Jimmy, I've spent my entire career adapting. I've worked in stand-up, television, film, voice work. I've evolved with technology, with audiences, with the business. What I haven't done is pretend that every change is automatically good, or that questioning the direction we're heading makes someone a dinosaur. But you are questioning it from a very particular perspective, Kimmel insists. A perspective that frankly has had it pretty good in Hollywood for a very long time. So forgive me if I don't see you as some kind of victim here. And there it is, Tim says, pointing at Kimmel. The moment you can't argue the substance, you go after the person. You dismiss what I'm saying because of who I am, where I come from, what you assume about me. That's not a counter-argument, Jimmy, that's an escape hatch. Kimmel's face flushes. I'm not dismissing you. I'm providing context. There's a difference. Context, Tim says with a bitter smile. That's a nice way of saying you've decided my opinion doesn't matter because I don't fit your preferred demographic. Tell me something. When did we decide that the validity of an idea depends on the identity of the person saying it, rather than the merit of the idea itself? Kimmel takes a deep breath, visibly trying to compose himself. That's a gross oversimplification of what I said, and you know it. I'm not saying your opinion doesn't matter because of who you are. I'm saying that your perspective is shaped by your experience, just like everyone's is. And maybe, just maybe, there are experiences you haven't had that might give you a different view of why some of these changes are necessary. So enlighten me, Tim says, spreading his hands. Tell me what I'm missing. But do it without assuming I'm coming from a place of ignorance or malice. Do it like you're talking to someone who might actually have valid concerns, even if they don't align perfectly with yours. Kimmel pauses, seeming to consider his approach. Okay, look, the reason people are more careful now, the reason there are more conversations about representation and impact, is because for a really long time, a lot of voices weren't heard. A lot of people were hurt by casual jokes and stereotypes that the rest of us didn't think twice about. So yes, things have changed. Yes, there's more scrutiny. But that's not oppression, Tim. That's evolution. I don't disagree that we needed to evolve, Tim responds, his tone slightly softer. I don't disagree that there were voices that needed to be heard, stories that needed to be told. What I'm pushing back on is the idea that the pendulum couldn't possibly have swung too far, that every single change is automatically good, that there's no room to say maybe we've overcorrected in some areas. And what areas are those? Kimmel asks, leaning in. The area where we've stopped being able to distinguish between genuine harm and simple disagreement, Tim says. The area where we've decided that making someone uncomfortable is the same as hurting them. The area where we've replaced actual dialogue with performative declarations of whose side you're on. The area where nuance goes to die because everything has to be absolute. Everything has to be black and white. And if you suggest any shade of gray, you're part of the problem. Kimmel's expression tightens again. You keep talking about nuance, but some things don't have nuance, Tim. Some things are right and wrong. And I'm sorry, but I'm not going to apologize for believing that we should treat people with dignity and respect. Neither am I, Tim shoots back, but here's where we differ. I don't think disagreeing with someone is the same as disrespecting them. I don't think questioning an idea is the same as attacking the people who hold that idea. And I don't think that everyone who doesn't fall in line with the current orthodoxy is automatically a bad person who needs to be re-educated or eliminated. Orthodoxy, Kimmel repeats, his voice dripping with frustration. You keep using these loaded terms. Nobody's trying to enforce an orthodoxy, Tim. People are just asking for basic human decency. And I'm asking who gets to define what that means, Tim counters. Because from where I sit, it looks like basic human decency only flows in one direction. You can mock, dismiss, and demean people who hold certain beliefs, and that's considered perfectly acceptable. But express skepticism about the prevailing wisdom on certain topics, and suddenly you're violating basic human decency. How does that make sense? Kimmel throws his hands up. Because there's a difference between punching up and punching down, Tim. There's a difference between challenging power and attacking the vulnerable. This isn't complicated. Except it is complicated, Tim insists. Because who decides who has power and who's vulnerable? Those categories shift depending on the context, depending on the issue, depending on who's doing the defining. You've got people with massive platforms, enormous wealth, institutional support, claiming to be powerless victims. And you've got ordinary people with no voice, no platform, no protection, being told they're the oppressors. If that's not complicated, I don't know what is. The studio audience is split now, some people nodding along with Tim, others clearly siding with Kimmel. The tension is palpable. Kimmel runs a hand through his hair, a gesture of exasperation. What do you want, Tim? What's your solution here? We just go back to the way things were? We just ignore the progress that's been made? I want us to be able to have this conversation, Tim says emphatically. I want us to be able to disagree without one of us being labeled a monster. I want us to be able to question things without being accused of wanting to tear down everything good. I want us to remember that the people we disagree with are still people, still human, still deserving of the same grace and understanding we demand for ourselves. That's a nice sentiment, Kimmel says, his voice heavy with skepticism. But it's easy to talk about grace and understanding when you're not the one being marginalized, when you're not the one whose existence is being debated. Tim's eyes flash with something between anger and hurt. And there you go again, making assumptions about what I have or haven't experienced. Deciding that because I don't fit your narrative of who gets to be heard, my perspective is automatically invalid. You talk about marginalization while marginalizing anyone who sees things differently than you do. You see the irony there, don't you? I see someone who's more concerned with his right to speak than with what he's actually saying, Kimmel retorts. I see someone who's wrapping himself in the language of free speech while ignoring the real harm that unchecked speech can cause. Unchecked speech, Tim repeats slowly. So speech should be checked? By whom? By you? By people who think like you? And what happens to speech that doesn't pass the check? What happens to the people behind that speech? Kimmel stands up now, fully on his feet. What happens is they face criticism, Tim. Tim stands up too, matching Kimmel's energy. The marketplace of ideas requires that ideas actually be allowed into the marketplace, Jimmy. What we have now is a gatekeeper system where certain ideas never even make it to the conversation. They're shut down before they begin. And you know what's interesting? You're standing here accusing me of wanting things my way, but you've spent this entire interview trying to shut down everything I'm saying. You haven't engaged with a single point I've made. You've just tried to discredit me, minimize me, and put me in whatever box makes it easiest for you to dismiss what I'm saying. Because what you're saying is nothing new, Kimmel fires back, his voice rising. It's the same tired complaint that people make when they can't say whatever they want without consequences. It's the same victimhood complex dressed up as principle. And frankly, I expected better from you. You expected better? Tim's voice is dangerously quiet now. You expected me to come on here and just nod along? To play my part in whatever narrative you had planned? That's the problem, isn't it? You don't actually want a conversation. You want compliance. You want agreement. You want everyone to fall in line and repeat the approved talking points. I want honesty, Kimmel says. And I'm being honest with you right now. I think you're wrong. I think your perspective is limited. And I think this whole conversation says a lot more about your discomfort with changing times than it does about any actual problem with free speech. Tim nods slowly, a calm settling over him that somehow feels more powerful than the heated exchange that preceded it. You know what, Jimmy? I appreciate your honesty. I really do. Because you've just proven everything I've been saying. You've decided I'm wrong not because you've considered my argument, but because you've decided my motivation must be bad. You've psychoanalyzed me, dismissed me, and tried to paint me as some bitter old man yelling at clouds. And you've done it while claiming to stand for open dialogue and understanding. Kimmel opens his mouth to respond, but Tim holds up a hand. Let me finish, because here's what just happened here, and everyone watching can see it. I came on here to have a conversation. I presented ideas, raised concerns, asked questions, and at every turn, instead of engaging with those ideas, you attacked me. You questioned my motivations, my character, my relevance. You did everything except actually address the substance of what I was saying. And that, right there, is exactly what I'm talking about. The audience is completely silent now. Kimmel's face is flushed, and you can see he's trying to formulate a response. But Tim isn't done. You talk about the marketplace of ideas, but you've spent the last 20 minutes trying to remove my ideas from that marketplace. You talk about accountability, but you seem to think that only applies to people who disagree with you. You talk about empathy and understanding, but you've shown none of that to me. Instead, you've demonstrated exactly the kind of intellectual intolerance that makes real conversation impossible. That's not fair, Kimmel manages to say, but his voice lacks the conviction it had earlier. Fair, Tim says with a sad smile. Is it fair that people lose their careers for expressing opinions? Is it fair that artists are afraid to create? Is it fair that we've created an environment where this, what we just did here, is considered controversial simply because two people disagreed? You want to talk about fair, Jimmy? Let's talk about what's fair. Why the... Kimmel takes a step back and you can see the fight going out of him. I think we've gotten off track here. No, Tim says firmly. I think we've gotten exactly where this needed to go. Because people need to see this. They need to see what happens when someone asks questions that make people uncomfortable. They need to see the deflection, the dismissal, the personal attacks. They need to see how the people who claim to be the most tolerant can be the most intolerant when faced with ideas they don't like. I'm not intolerant, Kimmel protests, but it sounds weak now. Maybe you don't think you are, Tim says, his voice gentler now. But Jimmy, you haven't listened to a single thing I've said with an open mind. You came into this conversation with your conclusion already drawn. You decided who I was and what I represented before I even sat down. And nothing I said was going to change that because you didn't want it to change. You wanted to be right. You wanted to put me in my place. You wanted to show everyone watching that people who think like me are the problem. Kimmel sits back down, looking deflated. I don't think you're the problem, Tim. Then what am I? Tim asks, still standing. Because you've spent this entire time treating me like an adversary. Like someone who needs to be defeated rather than understood. And if I'm not the problem, if I'm just someone with a different perspective, then why couldn't we have an actual conversation about these things? Why did it have to become this? The question hangs in the air. Kimmel looks at his desk, at the audience, anywhere but at Tim. I guess I got defensive. We all get defensive, Tim says, finally sitting back down. That's human. But we have to be able to get past that. We have to be able to hear things we don't like without immediately going to war. We have to be able to disagree without making it personal. And right now, as a society, as an industry, we're failing at that, spectacularly. Kimmel nods but doesn't speak. The audience doesn't know whether to applaud or stay silent. Tim looks directly at the camera. Here's what I hope people take from this.